Her father's hand didn't shake when he signed her name on that contract. That was the part Serena Vale couldn't stop thinking about afterward. Not the betrayal itself, not the stranger sitting at the head of the table who now legally owned the next 5 years of her life. It was her father's hand, steady, almost relieved, like he'd been carrying something too heavy for too long and had finally found somewhere to set it down. She had driven 4 hours to get to that dinner. She'd bought a new blouse, she'd practiced, in the car, the things she was going to say to start over. And her parents had sat across the table with their rehearsed smiles and their expensive wine and waited for the moment the ink dried. If you found out your own family had a price for you, and that price wasn't even very high, what would you do, Sam? If this story already has your pulse up, hit that like button right now and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. Subscribe if you haven't, because the stories coming next will shake you just as hard. Now stay with me. Every answer Serena finds will cost her something she didn't know she had. Serena noticed the candles first. Her parents didn't use candles. Her mother complained the wax dripped on the tablecloth. Her father said the flickering gave him headaches. But there they were, 12 of them, ivory, burning in a silver candelabra that didn't belong in the modest dining room she remembered from childhood. Someone had brought it in. Someone had set this room like a stage. She stood in the doorway with her overnight bag still on her shoulder, reading the room the way she'd learned to read rooms growing up in that house, looking for what was wrong before she walked all the way in. "You're late," her mother said, not looking up from adjusting a fork. "I drove the speed limit," Serena said. "There was construction." Her father came out of the kitchen holding a bottle of wine she didn't recognize, the kind with a label that doesn't announce itself, the kind people open when they're trying to impress someone they're afraid of. He kissed her cheek. His lips were dry and his eyes went to a point somewhere just past her shoulder. "Someone's joining us tonight," he said. "A business associate. Be polite." "What kind of business?" "The kind that doesn't require your questions." She should have left then. She would think about that for a long time afterward. The exact moment when leaving was still easy, when her bag was still on her shoulder and her keys were still in her hand. She stayed because she'd driven 4 hours, and because some part of her still wanted what she'd told herself this dinner was. A beginning. A chance. She set her bag down by the stairs and went to the table. He was already seated when she came in from washing her hands in the downstairs bathroom. She saw the back of his head first. Dark hair, cut close at the sides, posture that didn't accommodate the chair so much as tolerate it. When he turned at the sound of her footsteps, she registered the face in pieces. A jaw that looked like it had been set deliberately, the way you'd set a trap. Eyes that were gray or green depending on which candle flame they caught. She couldn't decide and couldn't stop looking. A scar she almost missed, thin and pale, running along his left cheekbone toward the corner of his mouth. He was younger than she expected. Whatever she'd expected. "Serena," her father said, already pouring wine he hadn't offered her. "This is Cassian Vesper." The name hit her somewhere in the chest before her brain had finished processing it. She'd heard it the way you hear thunder before you see lightning. The name that appeared in the kinds of news stories her coworkers skipped past, in conversations that stopped the moment she walked into the break room. The Vesper Syndicate. The organization that the city's district attorney had publicly called a cancer in a press conference 8 months ago, and then quietly dropped 3 active investigations against by the following spring. Cassian Vesper stood when she reached the table. Old reflex, practiced into habit. He held out his hand. She shook it because her father was watching and her mother had already sat down and the candles were burning and the wine was poured and everything in the room was pushing her forward. His grip was not hard. That surprised her. "Your father speaks highly of you," he said. "He doesn't know me well enough to," she said. Something shifted in his expression, not offense. Interest, like she'd answered a question he hadn't asked out loud yet. She sat down across from him and unfolded her napkin and told herself to eat whatever was put in front of her and say almost nothing and drive home in the morning having confirmed what she already believed, that nothing between her and her parents could be repaired, that coming here had been the last attempt, that she could stop trying now with a clean conscience. The food came. Her mother had cooked. The roast was slightly overdone, the way it always was. And there were green beans that Serena had hated since childhood, and no one at this table had ever noticed. She ate them. Cassian ate everything without apparent preference. Her father talked, about nothing, about the neighborhood, about a neighbor's new car, in the bright, effortful way of a man filling silence before something worse arrives. Cassian asked Serena what she did. Case management, she said. Child welfare. You work with the state? Nonprofit. The state doesn't fund it adequately, so. Do you like it? She looked at him directly for the first time since sitting down. Why are you here? Serena. Her father's voice was a warning stripped of authority. I'd like to know, she said, not breaking eye contact with Cassian. What kind of business associate requires candles and my mother's best roast on a Tuesday? Cassian picked up his wine glass, turned it once in his fingers, set it back down without drinking. The honest kind, he said, which is rarer than people admit. Dessert came. Her mother had made the chocolate cake she used to make for Serena's birthdays. Dense, a little bitter, imperfect, which meant it was the only food on the table that held any sincerity. Serena ate it and tried to interpret why it had been made tonight specifically and arrived at no conclusion she liked. It was after the plates were cleared that her father reached under his chair. He brought up a manila folder. Standard, unassuming, the kind you bought at any office supply store. He opened it on the table with the careful deliberateness of a man who had rehearsed this moment and was terrified of going off script. There's something we've needed to discuss, he said. About your future. My future? We've made some arrangements. He pushed the folder toward the center of the table. For your security, long term. Serena looked at the papers. Legal-sized, dense print. 2 signature lines at the bottom, one of which already bore her father's name in the careful cursive he used for formal documents. The other line was blank. She read the first paragraph. She read it again. Then she looked up at her father. What is this? It wasn't a question. The shape of her voice had changed, flattened, the way voices go when the body is deciding whether to fight or run and hasn't chosen yet. An agreement, he said. Between our family and Mr. Vesper's organization, you'll be... I can see what I'll be. Her hands were flat on the table. She was aware of them in a strange, distant way. The way you become aware of your own heartbeat. Because you can't stop it. You're selling me. It's a transfer of guardianship. I'm 24 years old. Her voice broke and reassembled in the same breath. You cannot transfer guardianship of a 24-year-old woman. The legal framework is, how much, she said. What did you get? Her mother looked at the candles. Her father looked at the folder. The number he said was so small that Serena made him repeat it because she was certain she'd misheard. She hadn't. She turned to Cassian. He was watching her. He'd been watching her the whole time in the way of someone who expects the scene they're witnessing and still finds it difficult. His face was not triumphant. It was not cold. It was something harder to read, like measured attention, and underneath it, something that might have been reluctance. She could have been misreading him completely. She filed the observation away regardless. And you, she said, what exactly do you want from me? Serena, her father again. I'm asking him. She didn't raise her voice. You've apparently already had your say. Cassian leaned forward slightly. His forearms came to rest on the table. To keep you safe, he said. That's all. That's not an answer. That's a sentence that sounds like an answer. I know. Then give me the actual one. He held her gaze without flinching and without explaining, which was its own kind of answer, the kind that meant he wouldn't say more at the table, in front of her parents, tonight, which meant there was more, which meant whatever she was in the middle of was larger than a dinner and a folder and a gambling debt she hadn't known her family was carrying. She stood up. She picked up the folder and walked to the kitchen. Her mother called after her. Her father scraped his chair back. She opened the folder over the sink and held one corner over the nearest candle she'd grabbed off the table on her way through. The paper caught slowly. She set the burning folder in the sink and watched it. Her father arrived in the kitchen doorway, breathing hard. Serena, there are copies. I know there are copies, she said, not turning from the sink. I burned it because I needed to do something I could actually do. By the time she went back to the dining room to get her bag from the hall, Cassian was standing. He made no move to stop her. His second in command, she registered him now. The large man who had been near the door all evening and whom she'd half-processed as furniture, stepped subtly sideways, not blocking the door, just redistributing his weight. Cassian said one word to him, low, quick. The man stepped back. I'll walk you to your car. Cassian said. You'll stay where you are, Serena said. She walked out. She made it to her car. She put the key in, and her hand was shaking so badly she dropped it and had to get it off the driveway floor in the dark. She got the car started. She sat there for 30 seconds with her forehead against the steering wheel. Then the passenger door opened and Cassian Vesper sat down beside her. She grabbed for the door handle on her side. He wasn't blocking it. He made no move to prevent anything. He just sat in the passenger seat of her 7-year-old Civic and looked forward through the windshield. Get out of my car, she said. In a moment. Now. There are 2 men parked at the end of the street, he said. They've been there since 4 this afternoon. They're not mine. Serena went still. If you pull out of this driveway without me in this car, they will follow you, and when they stop you, I won't be there. He said it flatly, without theater. The way you state a fact you'd prefer weren't true. The copies of the contract exist. The agreement is already registered through channels that courts in this city don't openly acknowledge. You can challenge it. I encourage you to. But tonight you're not safe, and those men outside do not want you alive. Why would anyone want me? Not here, he said it quietly, like the car might be listening. Not in front of your parents' house. She turned to look at him. The dark made his face harder to read. The scar caught a line of light from the street. Why should I trust you, she said. You're the one who agreed to buy me. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. That's a fair position. It's the only position. Then for tonight, he said, don't trust me. Just don't drive away from those men alone. She stared at the steering wheel. She did not trust him. She noted the men at the end of the street, a dark SUV she hadn't looked at twice when she arrived because why would she? And she felt the options narrowing the way walls narrow in bad dreams. She hated that the calculus was as simple as it was. She hated that he was right. If you touch me, she said, if any of your people, no one touches you. He said it without qualification. I'll tell you that once so you don't spend the night waiting for the other shoe. No one touches you. She put the car in reverse. Leave it, he said. We'll take mine. I'm not leaving my car here. They'll have it moved to the estate by tomorrow morning. By someone who knows how to drive a stick shift because the transmission has a quirk. I'll tell them. She turned off the engine. She sat for a second more in the silence with the windows starting to fog from their breath. I hate this, she said. Not to him specifically, just to the car, to the dark, to the particular feeling of having your choices removed one at a time until you're left with the only one that keeps you breathing. Yes, he said. I know. She got out of the car. She did not take his arm when he offered it. She walked to the waiting black vehicle with her bag on her shoulder and her burned hands shaking in her pockets, and her jaw set in a way that had taken her years to learn from the children on her caseload, the ones who were also being taken somewhere they hadn't chosen, and who had decided that their face was the one thing that still belonged entirely to them. Inside the vehicle, the doors closed. The street passed. Her parents' house shrank in the back window and then disappeared. In the front seat, separated from her by a partition of dark glass, Cassian Vesper gave a single quiet instruction to the driver. She didn't catch the words. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know why men she'd never met wanted her dead. She didn't know what her parents had spent 24 years not telling her. She had her bag and her phone and the bitter taste of chocolate cake and betrayal at the back of her throat. She pressed her back into the corner of the seat, and she stayed awake the entire drive, watching the city lights slide past the window like she was committing them to memory. She might need to. The estate appeared out of the dark, like something that had been there for centuries and intended to remain. Serena had expected gates. She hadn't expected how long the driveway was after the gates, how much space existed between the outside world and whatever this place was, as though distance itself was a form of security. Floodlights cut across manicured grounds at intervals. She counted 3 men at positions she could identify and assumed there were more she couldn't. The car moved slowly, deliberately, and when it finally stopped, she had to remind herself to breathe through her nose instead of her mouth, because breathing through her mouth felt like admitting something. A man opened her door. Not Cassian. She'd barely glimpsed him separating from the car and moving toward the entrance while she was still gathering herself. The man at her door was built like a question no one wanted to ask out loud. He said nothing. He simply stood there making space for her to exit, which she did, Because the alternative was sitting in a car that wasn't hers, in a driveway that wasn't anywhere she recognized. She followed at her own pace. No one rushed her. The interior of the house hit her differently than she expected. She'd braced for something that announced itself. Dark wood, mounted weapons, the aesthetic of power that enjoyed its own reflection. Instead, the entry hall was spare. High ceilings, light-colored stone, a single oversized piece of abstract art on the far wall in shades of gray and rust that she didn't understand but couldn't stop looking at. No trophies, no portraits, no visible evidence of what this place was. A woman appeared from a hallway, middle-aged, short hair going silver, wearing the particular expression of someone who manages everything behind the scenes and prefers it that way. "Miss Vale," she said, "I'm Petra. I handle the household. Your room is ready." "I'm not staying," Serena said. Petra looked at her with a patience that had clearly survived harder conversations. "Of course," she said. "Your room is ready nonetheless." Cassian was at the far end of the hall. He'd shed his jacket. I was speaking to the large man from the dinner, the second-in-command she'd catalogued as furniture, in a tone too low to carry. When he heard Serena's voice, he stopped and looked over. He said something final to the other man, who nodded and disappeared. "You should sleep," Cassian said, walking toward her without urgency. "Tomorrow is difficult regardless of what you decide." "What do I decide?" "Whether you want the explanation now or in the morning." "Now," she said immediately. Something crossed his face. Not surprise. More like he'd expected that and had preferences about it he wasn't going to act on. He looked at Petra. "Coffee," he said. "It's past midnight," Petra said. "I know what time it is." Petra made a sound that was not quite a sigh and turned back toward the kitchen. Cassian gestured toward a room off the hall. "Study," Serena registered. "Desk, bookshelves, 2 chairs pulled at angles toward each other that suggested the room was used for conversations people needed to sit down for." She went in. She did not sit. He sat. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and she had the impression he did this when he wanted to appear less large, which didn't entirely work but was interesting that he tried. "The men at the end of your parents' street," he said. "Tell me what you noticed about the vehicle." "Dark SUV, no plates visible from the angle I had, parked facing outward." "Facing outward, you caught that." "I catch things." "The plates were there," he said, "obscured deliberately. That's not a surveillance setup. That's an extraction team or an elimination team. You know the difference?" "I work with people who've run from both," she said. "Yes, I know the difference." He nodded slowly. "They've been tracking your location for approximately 6 weeks. We identified them 3 weeks ago." The air in the room felt different suddenly. Not colder, denser. "3 weeks ago," she said carefully. "And you arranged to have me delivered to your house? When exactly?" "The agreement with your parents was finalized 11 days ago. So you knew someone was coming for me and you decided the solution was to buy me." "The solution," he said, "was to get you inside a perimeter that team couldn't breach before they decided waiting was finished." He held her gaze. "Your parents were already in contact with my organization. They came to us. The debt was real. The arrangement was their offer, not mine. And you accepted it." "I accepted the outcome I needed. The mechanism was their choice." Serena felt her jaw tighten. "Don't dress that up. You signed a contract for a human being." "Yes." No qualification, no pivot, just the words sitting there flat and irrefutable. "I did. And I'd do it again to get you behind these walls before that team outside your parents' house stopped waiting." "Why?" She said it like a wall going up. "Why does it matter to you where I am? You didn't know me 3 weeks ago. You didn't know me 3 hours ago." He looked at her for a long moment. The study was quiet enough that she could hear the clock on the desk, and somewhere distant the sound of Petra in the kitchen. "Not tonight," he said. "You said I could have the explanation now." "Part of it." He sat back. "The part I can give you without documents I don't have in front of me. The part that answers why those men were watching you. That requires a conversation I need to prepare you for, and I won't do it at 1 in the morning when you've had the night you've had." She stared at him. "You're making decisions about what I can handle," she said. "I'm making decisions about what I can tell you accurately without the files that contain the specifics. There's a difference." "There isn't, from where I'm standing." Petra arrived with coffee. She set the tray between them without comment and withdrew. Serena didn't touch the cup. Cassian poured his own and held it without drinking, the way people hold something warm when they need something to do with their hands. "You're not a prisoner," he said. "I want to be clear about that. The room Petra has prepared, the door doesn't lock from the outside. You can walk the house freely. The exterior is guarded, yes, for your protection, not your containment. The distinction is thin. I know. If I tried to leave, I'd ask you not to. I wouldn't stop you physically. And the men outside the gate? They'd let you through." He paused. "And then I'd have 20 minutes at best before the people watching you realized you were no longer inside a defended perimeter, and considerably less time than that to reach you." She picked up the coffee. She needed something to do with her hands, too. It was bitter and strong, and she hadn't eaten anything at dinner besides green beans and chocolate cake, and her stomach registered the coffee like a small explosion, which was what she needed. "I want to see these files tomorrow," she said. "Whatever you're preparing me for, first thing, after you've slept. I don't sleep well under the best circumstances. Then after you've attempted it." He looked at her over his cup. "The room has a lock on the inside. Petra will show you where everything is. There's no one in that corridor overnight. I'll see to it personally." She looked at him, trying to find the angle. There was always an angle. She'd learned that from the families she worked with, the ones who appeared at her office door with clean clothes and honest faces and complete fabrications about why their kids had bruises in repeating patterns. Everyone had an angle. Everyone was trying to get something. "What do you want from me?" she said again. Different inflection this time. Not the demand she'd made at dinner. This was something closer to a genuine question, which cost her more to ask. Cassian was quiet for a moment longer than felt comfortable. "For you to be alive," he said, "when this is finished." She held that, turned it over, found the edges she didn't trust, and the part, buried somewhere below her sternum, that noted the way he said it. Not "I want you alive for my purposes," but something that landed differently, with a weight she hadn't expected. She did not trust the part of herself that noticed that. She stood up. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Miss Vale." She stopped at the door. "Serena. If I'm going to be here however long this lasts, it's Serena." She didn't look back. "Miss Vale sounds like I consented to something." She heard him exhale. Not a laugh exactly, but close to one. She followed Petra upstairs. The room was plain and large and had a window overlooking the rear grounds. She spent 20 minutes mapping everything she could see from that window, counting lights, noting the intervals of the guards' patterns. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands and stayed like that, not crying. She was too tired and too angry for that, just letting the shape of the day press down on her until it had finished. She did not sleep until nearly 4 in the morning, and when she did, she slept with her back against the headboard and her shoes still on. She woke to her phone buzzing, unknown number. She answered it because the day had already established that ignoring things made them worse. Silence on the other end, and then a voice she recognized, low, deliberately distorted, but carrying a pattern of speech she'd processed before. "You're making a mistake," the voice said. "He's not keeping you safe. He's keeping you convenient." She sat up straight. "Who is this?" The line went dead. She stared at her phone. The number was already gone. Not blocked, gone, as though it had belonged to a burner that had been destroyed in the seconds after the call connected. She dressed and went downstairs. Cassian was already awake. He was at a long table in what served as a command room. She hadn't been shown this room the night before. Standing over printed documents with 2 men she didn't know, and the large second-in-command whose name she still didn't have. When she appeared in the doorway, none of them reached for weapons, which she took as a small mark of either trust or contempt. "Someone called my cell," she said. "The number was wiped before I could trace it. They told me you're not keeping me safe. You're keeping me convenient." The room went still. Cassian straightened. He looked at the men around the table with a specific quality of stillness that she read, from the way the other men responded to it, as controlled fury. "Who has her number?" "It wasn't distributed," one of the men said quickly. "Only household contacts. Who has the number?" "I'll find out." The man was already moving. Cassian turned to Serena. In the daylight, he looked like he hadn't slept, or like he'd slept the way combat-trained people sleep. Enough to function, insufficient for anything resembling rest. The scar along his cheekbone was more visible now. Say the phrase again. Exactly. He's not keeping you safe. He's keeping you convenient. He absorbed that. She watched him process it, not with visible alarm, but with a deliberate internal stillness that she was beginning to recognize as the way he handled information he already suspected and hadn't wanted confirmed. It's someone who knows the terms of the arrangement, she said. Someone who knows I'm here and knew how to reach my phone. That's not a random threat. No, he said, it isn't. And you have a guess. I have several guesses. I'd prefer confirmation before I share them. Cassian. She used his name like a tool. If someone inside your organization is trying to get me to leave, they've already told me something you haven't. I deserve to be in this conversation. He looked at her steadily. Around the table, the remaining men were not quite visibly uncomfortable, but she registered the shift. The particular attention of people who were watching their leader navigate something he didn't have a clean playbook for. Ronan, he said to the large man, give us the room. Ronan, that was his name, she filed it, moved without comment. The others followed. When the door closed, Cassian pulled out the chair across from him and waited. Not with expectation, but with the plainness of someone who had decided to do something they'd been putting off. She sat down. He opened the folder closest to him. She couldn't see its contents yet. His hand rested on it, not covering it, just present, as though he needed a second more before the conversation became irreversible. Your parents, he said, were paid in 2001 to take in a child and raise her under a false name. Serena's spine did something she had no vocabulary for. Not a chill. More like the moment before you understand a sentence, when the words are hitting your ears but the meaning hasn't connected yet. The child was the biological daughter of a man named Vincent Marrow, he continued. If that name means anything to you, it doesn't. It will. He opened the folder. Vincent Marrow built the largest independent criminal network this region has ever produced, not affiliated with any existing family, not subservient to any external authority. He built it from nothing, and he ran it without a partner for nearly 2 decades. He turned a page toward her. A photograph. Grainy, surveillance quality, a man she'd never seen in her life. Dark-haired, older, with a stillness in his posture she recognized from somewhere she couldn't place. He refused to sell or surrender control when 3 rival syndicates pressured him in 2001. They arranged to have him disappeared. Killed. Disappeared. There's no confirmed body. Before he vanished, he hid his daughter. He placed her with a couple who had no criminal connections, paid them substantially to protect her, and sealed the record of her identity. Serena was very still. Her name was Don't, she said. He stopped. She sat there. The folder was in front of her, and the photograph of the man was in front of her, and the specific quality of the morning light was coming through the blinds at an angle that put a bar of gold across the table between them, and her whole body was deciding something about how to exist in the next 30 seconds. The couple he paid, she said. What happened to the money? Cassian's jaw tightened fractionally. From what we can reconstruct, spent, and then gambled, and then borrowed against, over approximately 15 years. She felt the chocolate cake and the green beans and the bitter coffee do something complicated in her stomach. They were broke by the time they came to you, she said. Yes. Because they'd spent the money meant to protect me. Yes. She put her palms flat on the table. She looked at them, her own hands, her own knuckles, the small white scar on her left thumb from a kitchen accident at 14 when she'd been trying to cook her own dinner because neither of her parents had come home. The inherited habit of self-reliance. She had always thought that was character. It had been necessity. The men who want me dead, she said. The heirs and successors to the syndicates that removed Vincent Marrow. If you're legally identified as his heir, and the documentation to establish that exists sealed in locations I have access to, you become the controlling party of assets, accounts, and alliance agreements that have been technically unclaimed for 23 years. He paused. That's a significant sum. How significant? He told her. She heard the number and said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say to a number like that. It sat in the room between them like a third presence. So everyone wants me dead, she said finally. Most parties who know about you, yes. And you. I want you alive. He said it the same way he'd said it the night before. Not as reassurance, as statement of fact. I've wanted you alive since I found out who you were. That's why I accepted your parents' offer. Because getting you inside this estate before those men outside the house made their move was the only option I had that worked on the timeline I had. What's in it for you? She meant it as a hard question. It came out sounding like she actually wanted to know, which was worse. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she still couldn't categorize. Your father trusted someone once, he said. That trust ended him. I had reasons to make sure the same thing didn't happen to his daughter. You knew him. Briefly, long enough. She sat with that. It wasn't a full answer. He knew it and she knew it. But it had the texture of something true. Rough-edged, incomplete, not performing itself for her benefit. I want to see everything, she said. Every document, every photograph, every piece of whatever file you have on who I supposedly am. After you eat something. Cassian, you've had coffee and green beans and shock in approximately that order. He stood. Eat something. Then I'll show you everything I have. She wanted to argue on principle. She could feel her body registering the specific kind of hollow that comes after an adrenaline night, and she recognized the pragmatism of the request even while resenting it. She followed him to the kitchen. Petra was there, operating with the particular efficiency of someone who existed to make things function before anyone had to ask. She put food in front of Serena without commentary. Eggs, toast, sliced fruit that Serena ignored. And Serena ate because she needed to, mechanically, with her mind already 2 rooms away turning over everything that had just been laid in front of her. She was mostly through the eggs when the sound reached her. She identified it half a second after Cassian moved, the distant percussive impact of something heavy, somewhere on the property. Then 3 sharp cracks in quick succession that she recognized from the cases she'd worked near housing projects, the ones where the children described specific sounds, and she'd learned to know them. Gunfire. Cassian was already at the door to the hall, and the next moment Ronan was there from the opposite direction, moving fast with his hand at his side. They exchanged 4 words she couldn't fully catch. Perimeter, East Wing, already inside. And then Cassian turned back. His face was different, cleared of everything except a specific operational focus that had no room for hesitation or doubt. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides. With me, he said. Now. Who? Move. She moved. He put her in front of him and kept one hand at her back, not gripping, just present, maintaining contact so he could redirect her if he needed to without wasting a second on instruction. They moved through corridors she hadn't seen yet, faster than felt safe, but with a precision that suggested he knew exactly where every turn was without looking. Another impact. Closer. The lights in the east corridor flickered. A door burst open. 3 figures in black tactical gear came through it. And none of them hesitated. None of them shouted a warning or announced themselves. And that told Serena everything she needed to know about whether these were law enforcement. Cassian pushed her behind him with one arm. What happened next she would never be able to describe in a sequence she fully trusted, because her brain recorded it the way the brain records car accidents, in fragments, with gaps, with the sensory details that don't matter burned in clearest. The smell of cordite, the sound of something hitting the floor, the specific quality of Cassian's breathing, which was controlled and even and utterly at odds with what she was watching him do. He moved through the 3 of them with a frightening economy. No wasted motion, no hesitation in the decision-making. One man went down, then the second, then there was a moment where the third had an angle she could see from where she was pressed against the wall, and her heart seized. And then it was over, and all 3 were on the floor, and the corridor was very loud with her own pulse. Cassian came back to her. He was breathing harder than he had been. His left arm was against his body at a slightly wrong angle. You're hit, she said. Grazed. That's not... Later. He scanned both ends of the corridor. The files I mentioned. The sealed documentation establishing your identity. His eyes came to her. I need you to understand something. What? Those men weren't here for me. His voice was level and specific. The primary target in the briefing they were operating from was you. She absorbed that. Someone gave them access, he said, to the schedule, the layout, the household, someone with that level of detail. He looked at her steadily. This isn't an external attack. Meaning the person who called your phone this morning wasn't trying to warn you. He held her gaze. They were trying to move you out of position before the team arrived. The walls of the corridor were solid and real, and she pressed one hand flat against one of them because she needed to feel something that wasn't moving. "Someone in your organization," she said. "Someone I trust," he said, and the weight in it was not self-pity. It was something older and more specific, the particular grief of a person understanding for the first time the shape of a betrayal they should have seen and didn't. The house alarm engaged. Somewhere deeper in the estate, men were running, and Serena stood in a corridor with 3 unconscious bodies and a man who'd just taken a bullet for her, and the new, irreversible knowledge that whoever had sent this team, whoever had fed them the layout, the timing, the specific information about where she'd be, was still inside the building, still trusted, still close, and there was no version of this she could walk away from anymore. The medic's name was Darrow, and he worked with the particular silence of someone who had stitched up wounds in rooms where making noise was inadvisable. Serena watched him close the gash along Cassian's upper arm with the focused attention she used to give to case files. Not because she wanted to, but because looking at the wound was easier than looking at Cassian's face while he sat on the edge of the desk in the command room and let himself be worked on without expression. The bullet had taken a long, shallow groove through the muscle below his left shoulder. Darrow said 3 things the entire time: that it would need to be properly cleaned, that Cassian should limit use of the arm for 72 hours, and that Cassian would ignore both of these instructions. Cassian didn't confirm or deny. Ronan stood by the door with his arms crossed and his eyes moving between the room's 2 entrances in a rhythm so practiced it had become unconscious. 4 other men were deployed through the house. The 3 from the corridor had been removed. Serena didn't ask where. "The layout," she said, when Darrow had finished and gathered his kit and left without being told to. "You said whoever sent that team had access to the layout." "And the schedule," Cassian said. He flexed his left hand once, testing, cataloging the damage, and then stopped. "They knew where you'd be, the kitchen, that window, that specific corridor. That's not information that exists outside this estate." "How many people have it?" 12, maybe 14, including the kitchen staff. "Then we narrow it." "We're narrowing it." He looked at Ronan. "The cell phone trace." Ronan moved to the table and opened a laptop. "Burner. Activated at 6:17 this morning. Used once, destroyed. The signal pinged off a tower 3 blocks from this address." 3 blocks, Serena said. "It was someone already here. Or someone who drove close enough to use a local tower and then left. We can't confirm stationary versus mobile from the ping alone." Ronan kept his eyes on the screen. He had the kind of face that didn't give anything away by default. Not unfriendly, just sealed. She found herself studying it the way she studied faces she hadn't made a read on yet. But the phrasing of the message is interesting. He's keeping you convenient. That's an inside characterization. Someone who knows how Cassian operates, what his motivations look like from close range. "Someone who resents it," Cassian said. The room sat with that. Serena crossed to the table and looked at the laptop screen without invitation. Ronan didn't move to block her. The documents open were communications logs, timestamps, encrypted routing addresses, none of it legible to her in terms of content. "What aren't you saying?" she asked Ronan directly. His eyes moved to Cassian for a fraction of a second. "Don't do that," she said. "Whatever the question is, ask it or answer it. I'm past being managed." Ronan looked at her steadily. He had pale eyes, the kind that registered everything and returned almost nothing. "There's a window in the contingency planning that was shared approximately 6 weeks ago," he said. "A document that detailed the timeline for acquiring you, the estate layout as it stood after the East Wing renovation, and the shift rotations for perimeter security." He paused. "I drafted that document." The room temperature didn't change. Serena's perception of it did. "You drafted it," she said, "and distributed it to 4 people. Myself, Cassian, and 2 senior captains. For operational security purposes, it wasn't circulated further." His voice was level, factual. "The attack was coordinated from information in that document, which means the compromise came from one of 4 sources. One of which is you. One of which is me," he agreed. He said it without flinching, which either meant he was telling the truth or was very good. She'd met people who were very good. "I'm telling you this because Cassian would have told you eventually, and I'd rather you hear the logic from me directly. I didn't send that call. I didn't coordinate that team, but I cannot prove a negative, and I understand that." She turned to Cassian. He was watching Ronan with an expression she had no way to date. She didn't know these people well enough to know if this was a new look or one that had been building for years. Something in the set of his jaw suggested the latter. "Who are the two captains?" she said. "Mercer and Diane," Cassian said. "Mercer has been with me 11 years. Diane, 6. Where are they now?" "Mercer is in the East Quadrant running the perimeter sweep. Diane is—" He stopped. He looked at Ronan. "Where's Diane?" Ronan's hands paused over the keyboard for a half-second that Serena clocked. "Last confirmed position was the vehicle bay, 40 minutes ago." 40 minutes ago. "I've been running the communication log. I haven't physically verified." Cassian was already at the door. She followed without being asked, because standing in a room, she didn't know. While the situation evolved in rooms she couldn't see was not a choice she was capable of making. The vehicle bay was 3 corridors and 1 interior staircase away. Cassian moved fast, not running, but with the compressed speed of someone whose legs understand urgency without broadcasting it. She kept up. She'd spent years walking fast through hospital corridors and housing complexes and intake facilities, where slowing down meant someone else made decisions before you arrived. The vehicle bay was empty of people and full of vehicles. 4 black SUVs, a panel van, a sedan, and smelled of exhaust and rubber and something that might have been recent tire movement. One of the bay doors stood open 8 inches. Not open, ajar. The kind of ajar that happens when someone leaves in a hurry and doesn't close things properly behind them. Cassian crouched beside a dark smear on the concrete near the 3rd vehicle. He pressed 2 fingers to it and looked at them. "Recent," he said. "Blood?" "Oil." He stood. "From the van's undercarriage. It hasn't been moved in 3 weeks. Someone crawled underneath it." He straightened and looked at the open door. "He's gone." "Diane." "Yes." She processed that. Running confirms it. Running confirms he knew we were narrowing it. He turned and she saw the specific quality of anger that lives below the surface of people who rarely let it come up. Not explosive, not loud, just a dense and clarifying fury that changed the temperature of whatever it touched. "He had an hour on us. Maybe more." "Can you find him?" "Yes." Cassian said it without hesitation and without explanation, and something in the way he said it made her not ask for one. They went back to the command room. What followed was 2 hours that Serena spent in a chair against the wall watching a specific kind of controlled chaos. Men arriving with information in fragments, Cassian and Ronan assembling it into something coherent without visible disagreement, calls made in codes she couldn't break. She was given coffee she didn't remember accepting, and at some point Petra appeared at her elbow with something to eat that she held but didn't touch. She was not pretending to be calm. She was doing something more functional than calm. She was running the logic forward, the way she'd learned to do at intake assessments when the situation in front of her was bad enough that she had to think 6 steps ahead just to find the step that prevented the worst outcome. She had a name, Vincent Marrow. She had a parentage she hadn't asked for and couldn't verify from the inside of her own memory. Nothing in her childhood had been labeled, nothing had been handed to her with a note attached, and she was aware that her biology had simply been a background condition she'd never had a reason to examine. She had an inheritance she hadn't chosen and didn't want. She had at least one enemy inside a house that was supposed to be the safest place available. And she had something else. Something small, which she hadn't yet shared. When Cassian stepped away from the table for a moment, 2 minutes, maybe less, to take a call in the adjacent room, she leaned toward Ronan. "The encrypted files," she said quietly, "on the network drive in the study. I saw them last night." Ronan's pale eyes came to her. "Which directory?" "I don't know what to call it. It was under a file name that looked like a date, month, year, 2001. He was very still. "You accessed it." "I saw it. I didn't open it. I don't have credentials." She held his gaze. "What's in it?" He held the pause 1 second longer than was comfortable. "The original placement documentation," he said, "for the child. Photographs, identity records, the financial arrangement with your parents, and—" he stopped. "And a secondary document, separate authorization, for an individual assigned to monitor your safety from a distance once you reached adulthood." He looked at her with the same sealed expression he'd maintained the entire conversation. "The monitor was supposed to alert the organization if you were located by hostile parties." She thought about this. Supposed to. The alert was never sent. Because. Because the monitor was compromised, he said, or chose not to. We don't know which. Who was the monitor? Before he could answer, the door to the adjacent room opened, and Cassian came back in. Ronan's eyes went to the screen. The moment sealed itself over. She noted it. She filed it. Diane was located at 11:47 in the morning in a parking structure 11 miles from the estate. He was located because he tried to access a financial account that the organization held without realizing the account had been flagged 3 weeks earlier as a secondary security measure. The access triggered a trace. The trace confirmed his position. He was brought in at 1:15. Serena was in the study when they brought him through. She heard the door, heard the change in the quality of the house's sound, and came to the doorway of the command room without entering it. Diane was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s, with the kind of face that looked like it had been handsome once and had absorbed enough tension to change its quality. He was not physically restrained, which surprised her. He stood in the center of the room with his hands at his sides and his chin up in the way of someone who has decided on a presentation and is committing to it. Cassian stood across from him with his hands in his pockets. The silence lasted long enough to be deliberate. "You're not going to ask me anything," Diane said. "You already know." "I know what the evidence shows," Cassian said. "I want to hear what you have to say about it." "Why? You've already decided." "I haven't decided anything." Cassian's voice was level as poured concrete. "That's not how this works. You know that." Diane's jaw shifted. He looked at a point past Cassian's shoulder. The practiced avoidance of someone who knows the face across from them too well to maintain eye contact for this particular conversation. "6 months ago," he said, "someone reached out through a cutout. I thought it was a probe, a test of loyalty. I didn't respond." "The first time." Diane's eyes moved. The second contact had specifics, things that couldn't have been probed. They had to have come from inside. They told me about the Marrow girl, before any of us knew. They knew weeks before the agreement with the parents was finalized. He exhaled hard through his nose. I realized it wasn't a test. Someone already had a source inside. And instead of telling me, they had my brother's location. The words came out flat, stripped of performance. My brother, who has been in protective witness housing for 3 years under a name I don't know. They had a photograph. A current one, not more than a week old. They told me if I cooperated, they'd leave him alone. The room was very quiet. Serena saw Cassian absorb this. The specific way a man absorbs information that changes the moral shape of a thing he'd already processed as simple. She watched his stillness deepen by a degree. "You should have come to me," he said. "They said if I came to you, my brother was dead in 48 hours. I could have protected him." "Could you?" Diane looked at him now, and there was no performance in it. 2 months ago, could you have protected someone you didn't know was in danger, in a location you didn't have, from people who already had an inside source in your organization? He didn't raise his voice. Could you? The silence that followed was not comfortable for anyone in it. "What did you give them?" Cassian said. "The layout, the shift rotations, the timeline for bringing her in." He looked at Serena briefly. "Not to have her killed. I was told the team was extraction. Bring her in for negotiation. That's what I was told." "They sent in 3 men with suppressed weapons and kill authorization," Serena said from the doorway. Diane looked at her steadily. Something crossed his face. Something that might have been the moment a lie a person has told themselves finally stops working. "I know," he said. "I know what they sent." "Who's they?" she said. "Specifically." He shook his head. "Not refusal. Defeat. Cutouts the whole way down. I have a phone number that's already dead and a drop address I've never seen a person at." "Think further back," Cassian said. "The initial contact, how did they reach you?" "Through Mercer." The room shifted again. Serena saw it in Ronan's posture first, the almost imperceptible change, a man confirming something he'd suspected and hadn't wanted to. "Mercer," Cassian said. "He handed me the first message, told me it had come through a Bratislava channel, and he didn't know what it meant. I believed him." Diane paused. "I still don't know if he knew what he was passing. Mercer has been yours since before I came in. I can't see him flipping." "People flip for more than money," Serena said. She was thinking of families in her caseload. Fathers who protected abusers because the alternative was loneliness they couldn't survive. Mothers who signed things they shouldn't have because someone had found the specific pressure point that bypassed all rational calculation. What does Mercer love that he'd lose? Nobody answered immediately. Then Ronan spoke without looking up from the screen. His daughter, he said. She's been receiving treatment at a private facility upstate for 14 months. Degenerative, expensive. He paused. The billing records show the payments stopped being processed through Mercer's accounts 8 months ago. Someone else started paying, Serena said. Yes. Cassian turned and walked to the window. He stood with his back to the room for 10 seconds. She counted. When he turned back, his face was the same as it had been, but something behind it had completed a decision. Ronan, he said, bring Mercer in. If I do it in front of the other men, bring him in quietly. Tell him I need a perimeter assessment, one-on-one. He looked at Diane. You'll stay here. You're not under restraint. I need you to think very carefully about everything those contacts ever communicated. Phrasing, timing, any geographical specific, anything that didn't make sense at the time. Write it down. Diane nodded. He looked hollowed out in the way of someone who has put down something they've been carrying in secret for too long. Ronan left. Cassian crossed to where Serena stood in the doorway and spoke quietly, his back partially to the room. I owe you an adjustment. To what? To my assessment of what we're dealing with. His voice was low and specific. This isn't a rival family moving on the Marrow inheritance opportunistically. This has been orchestrated, coordinated from inside the organization for, based on what Mercer's payments tell us, at least 8 months, probably longer. He looked at her with the directness she'd come to recognize as his version of honesty. Someone built the conditions for this. Someone who understood the organization's structure from a position of genuine access. And you have a guess about who that is? A theory. He paused. Not a guess. Tell me. He opened his mouth, and then Ronan appeared at the far end of the corridor, and the expression on Ronan's face was something Serena had seen only a handful of times in her life, on people arriving at a scene they'd been called to and found worse than the report had described. Mercer isn't in the East Quadrant, Ronan said. Cassian went very still. He finished the perimeter sweep 40 minutes ago and was last confirmed at the North Gate. The guard who saw him says he received a call and walked to the far corner of the gate structure. Ronan held his phone out with the screen facing Cassian. This was sent to the household general line 4 minutes ago. Cassian looked at the screen. His face did not change. He handed it to Serena. It was a photograph. Mercer, inside what looked like a vehicle, with a man beside him she'd never seen. The man's face was partially obscured. Mercer was looking at the camera with an expression she read immediately as forced, the expression of someone being made to perform calm for documentation purposes. Below the photograph, a single line of text. No greeting, no signature. Send the girl to the Alcott address by 6 o'clock. Mercer comes home. The offer closes with him. She lowered the phone. The Alcott address. She didn't know it, but Cassian did. She could tell from the specific quality of recognition that moved across his face, brief as a cloud shadow, and left something harder in its wake. What's at the Alcott address? She said. It's a meat site, he said. Neutral ground historically, used for negotiations between families when the parties need a location neither side controls. Neutral ground, she said. Except you just said this has been orchestrated from inside your organization. So the person choosing the meat site knows your protocols. Yes. Which means neutral is a word they're using without meaning it. Yes. She looked at the photograph again. Mercer's hands were folded in his lap in a way that looked deliberate, fingers interlaced, knuckles white against dark fabric. An old tale she'd seen in children who were frightened and trying not to show it. She had the sudden, unwelcome thought that whoever had arranged his daughter's medical payments had not done so out of kindness. You're not sending me, she said. No. But you can't not respond. If he dies, I know. Then what? Cassian was quiet for 3 seconds. She'd learned in those 3 days what his silences meant. This one was not hesitation. It was assembly, the way a person sounds when they're building a structure in real time and checking its load-bearing capacity before they speak. I need the Alcott address blueprints, he said to Ronan. Everything we have on the site, historical use, entry and exit points, sight lines. And I need the sealed files from the 2001 directory. Ronan's eyes moved to Serena. She's cleared, Cassian said. She's cleared for everything. Something in Ronan's expression shifted. Not surprise exactly. Recalibration. The specific look of someone who has been holding a partial truth in a particular position for a long time and is being asked to move it. The 2001 directory, he said, includes documentation that... He stopped. He started again. There's a secondary authorization document in that file for a long-term monitoring assignment. He looked at Serena directly. I was going to tell you when Cassian came back into the room earlier, before Diane was brought in. Tell me what, she said. The monitor assigned to track your safety into adulthood, he said. The one who failed to report when hostile parties located you. He exhaled through his nose. The assignment was registered under a name, a cover name, standard protocol. But the authorization code attached to it is an internal identifier, specific to one person. Ronan, Cassian said. Something in his voice had changed. The authorization code, Ronan said, looking at Cassian now, and the quality of his voice was the quality of a man standing at the edge of something he's been standing near for years and has finally decided to step off, is yours. The room did not make a sound. Serena looked at Cassian. He looked at Ronan. And in the specific weighted silence between two men who had stood side by side through things she had no knowledge of, she watched the shape of the next 20 seconds determine something that could not be undetermined. You were the monitor, she said to Cassian. It wasn't a question. The pieces had already moved into position. Vincent Marrow trusted you to watch over his daughter, and you didn't report when she was located. Cassian turned to look at her. She saw it in his face. Not guilt, which would have been easier, but something more complicated and more honest. The look of a man who had made a specific calculation and had been living with it, and was now standing at the moment where the bill arrived. Why? She said. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her with the gray-green eyes she'd been reading since the dinner table, and the scar catching the light from the window, and the controlled breath of a man deciding how much truth the moment could hold. Because reporting your location meant triggering a protocol, he said. A protocol that Vincent built before he disappeared. One that would have activated every remaining alliance in his network, dozens of people, dozens of families, to converge on your position to establish the inheritance claim. That sounds like protection. It sounds like it, he said. And for the first 12 hours it might have been. And after that, he stopped. The people who removed your father have been inside those alliance networks for years. Waiting. If I'd triggered the protocol, you would have been found by everyone simultaneously, including them. So you kept quiet to keep the protocol from activating. I kept quiet to keep you invisible. He said it plainly. For as long as I could. She stood there with the weight of it. The specific weight of a truth that explains something and makes it worse at the same time. She understood the logic. She had used similar logic herself. The emergency that you don't call in, because calling it in brings the wrong people faster than the right ones. She had made that calculation in a hospital corridor with a child's arm in her hands, deciding who to call and who to delay, because the system was broken in specific ways she'd mapped over years, and the mapping mattered for survival. She understood it. She also understood that he had made a decision about her life that she hadn't been given the chance to make for herself. When does the Alcott deadline expire? She said. 4 hours and 11 minutes, Ronan said. Then we have 4 hours. She looked at Cassian. And you're going to tell me everything you know about my father before we use a single one of them on anything else. Not the summary, not the version you've decided I can handle. Everything. She held his gaze until she saw the answer form in it. Because whoever is waiting at that address built this over years, and they know things about who I am that I don't know about myself yet. And I am done being the least informed person in a room about my own life. Cassian looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out the chair at the head of the table. Sit down, he said. And from the way he said it, not as a command, but as the kind of invitation that means what comes next will change you, and I need you to be seated for it. She understood that whatever was in those files had been waiting for her since before she was old enough to read her own name. She sat down. And Cassian Vesper began to tell her who she really was. The files took 40 minutes to get through, not because there were so many pages, There were, but that wasn't why. It was because every few minutes, Serena had to stop and set something down. Not physically, but in the way you set down a weight you've been carrying without knowing it, which is slower and more disorienting than setting down anything you can touch. Vincent Marrow had kept records the way a man keeps records when he knows he won't be there to explain them, exhaustively, with a specificity that suggested he'd understood from early on that the documentation would eventually have to speak for itself. There were photographs. Her as an infant, which she couldn't look at for long. Her at 3 or 4, which she also couldn't look at for long, but for different reasons. She recognized the apartment in the background, the specific wallpaper pattern she'd always assumed her parents had chosen, and now understood had been the apartment before the relocation, before the name change, before the life she'd grown up inside without knowing its architecture. There were financial records. There were 2 letters in handwriting she didn't recognize that were addressed to her by a name she'd never been called, and she folded those and put them in her jacket pocket without reading them all the way through because she needed to be functional for the next 4 hours, and she understood that those letters would make her something other than functional. Cassian told her the rest in plain sentences without softening. Vincent Marrow had built his network to be ungovernable by any single outside authority, structured so that it would survive him, sustained by alliances that were less about loyalty than about mutual self-interest carefully maintained. When he disappeared, those alliances had frozen, waiting. Not dissolved, waiting. For a legal heir to either activate or dissolve the inheritance. For 23 years, the assets had sat in accounts that no one could access without her specific biometric authorization and the sealed documentation currently in this building. Billions. Frozen. And the people who had removed Vincent Marrow had been waiting for 2 decades for someone to make the mistake of finding her. "Ronan," she said when Cassian had finished. "The address. Show me the blueprints." The Alcott building was a former textile warehouse on the edge of the industrial district that had been used as a meat site for 3 decades because of its specific geography. A single main floor with clear sightlines in every direction, 4 entry and exit points. No basements, no upper levels that could serve as sniper positions without being visible from the floor. It was designed to be a place where both parties could see each other and see every corner at the same time. Theoretically equal. "They'll have the exits covered," she said, studying the schematic. "If the site was chosen by someone who knows your protocols, they'll know you'll enter from the north because that's the approach that gives your team the best sight angle on arrival." "Yes," Cassian said, "which means the north approach is the one they've prepared for." "Yes." "Then we don't use it." She tapped the east entry on the schematic. "This one. It's narrower, it's less defensible for us on entry, but if they've concentrated preparation on the north, they'll have the east covered too, as a secondary. But secondary means fewer resources, and fewer resources means a window." She looked up. "How many people do you have available?" Cassian and Ronan exchanged a look that had the quality of 2 people revising an estimate in real time. 8 I trust completely," Cassian said. "Beyond that, the compromise question is open." 8. She absorbed this. "Who's at the Alcott site right now? What's your read?" "Ronan." Ronan straightened. He'd been quiet for the last 20 minutes, in the way of someone who understands that the conversation has moved into territory where speaking requires certainty he doesn't have. Based on the message and the resources we know they've been mobilizing, at least 1 rival family, possibly 2, coordinated. The person running this isn't operating alone. They needed alliance backing to pull the attack on this estate and have Mercer in hand simultaneously. "So we're walking into a room with multiple parties," Serena said. "Almost certainly. And the person who arranged all of it is in that room." "Yes," Cassian said. She looked at the clock on the wall. 2 hours and 50 minutes remained. She'd spent 40 on the files and 20 on the schematic, and she could feel time moving in a way she didn't usually feel it. Not rushing, which would have been manageable, but shrinking, the way the distance to the edge of something shrinks when you're moving toward it at a fixed speed. "I'm going," she said. "No," Cassian said. Not loudly. With the flat certainty of a man who has prepared this answer. "If I don't go, Mercer dies and they move to the next pressure point. And there will be one, because whoever built this built contingencies." She met his gaze. "And if they don't get me at the meet, they'll keep building pressure until something inside this organization breaks the rest of the way. You know that. You're not leverage, you're the target." "I'm both." She kept her voice even. And I'm also the only person in this situation with something they actually want. The biometric authorization. The air identification. She let that sit for 1 second. I go in, and I go in as what I am. Not hidden, not extracted, present. That's Cassian. She said his name the way you say the name of someone you need to stop performing for you. You kept me invisible for years because triggering the protocol meant bringing everyone to one location simultaneously. Right now, everyone is already converging on one location simultaneously. The condition you were trying to prevent already exists, so the logic that kept me quiet doesn't apply anymore. He looked at her. She could see him taking it apart, not because he wanted to find a flaw, but because if there was one, he needed to locate it before they were inside that building. A full 10 seconds passed. You stay beside me, he said. Not behind me, not ahead. Beside. Agreed. If I tell you to move, you move without asking why. Agreed. And you don't negotiate with anyone in that room without me present. She held his gaze. On that one, she said, I'll agree to try. It wasn't what he wanted. It was what she could honestly offer. He took it. They left the estate at 4:40. 8 men in 2 vehicles, moving in a route that took them 14 minutes longer than the direct approach, because the direct approach was the one that would be watched. Serena sat in the back of the second vehicle with Cassian on her left and a man named Callum on her right, who had not spoken a word to her but had positioned himself with a specific intention that she recognized. The geometry of someone whose job was to be a body between her and whatever came through the door. She thought about the letters in her jacket pocket. She didn't read them. She looked out the window at the city moving past and tried to remember that the city was full of people having ordinary evenings, making dinner, arguing about small things, going to sleep in houses where the doors weren't guarded and the name they answered to had always been theirs. The Alcott building arrived without ceremony. It was exactly what the schematic had shown. Large, brick, exhaling the smell of decades of industrial use. Windows that were opaque with grime, except at the edges where the setting sun came through in long, rust-colored lines. 2 vehicles sat outside that weren't theirs. She counted and stopped counting. Cassian touched her arm once, briefly. Not instruction. She understood it as something else and didn't examine what. They went in through the east entrance. The interior was exactly what the blueprints promised, and more complicated than any blueprint conveys, because blueprints don't show the quality of shadow or the specific acoustic of a large empty space, the way footsteps announce themselves before the person does. Their 8 men spread with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before. Taking positions at angles she could see were deliberate. Overlapping fields of sight, no single point of failure. At the center of the floor, in the hollow industrial light, 3 men stood. She recognized none of them. Then one of them moved slightly, and she saw, behind him, Mercer, seated, hands tied to a chair with the specific plainness of something done for demonstration purposes rather than security. His face was intact. He was conscious. He looked at Cassian with an expression she read as apology and shame in equal measure, which told her that whatever he'd done or been made to do, he'd understood the weight of it the entire time. The man at the front of the 3 spoke. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, with the particular bearing of someone who has been in rooms like this many times and has found a way to be comfortable in them. He spoke to Cassian first, not to her, which she noted. "You brought her," he said, as though confirming a prediction he'd made to himself. "I brought her," Cassian said. "That's either very smart or very foolish, and I haven't decided which." "Neither have I," Cassian said. Serena stepped forward so that she was even with Cassian, not behind him. She saw the silver-haired man's eyes adjust. She'd learned early in her work that you could tell a great deal from how a person's eyes adjusted when a woman did something they weren't expecting, whether they recalibrated or whether they filed it away as an irritant to be managed. This man recalibrated. She noted that too. "Ronan Sloan sends his regrets," the man said. The temperature of the room changed. Cassian went very still beside her. "Say that again." "Ronan Sloan." The man said it with the patient enunciation of someone delivering information they know will take a moment to land. "He asked me to convey that he's sorry for the theatrical nature of this. He preferred a cleaner resolution. Unfortunately, the timeline didn't cooperate." "Ronan is at the estate," Cassian said. The flatness in his voice was absolute. "Ronan is wherever Ronan needs to be." The man tilted his head slightly. He's been patient for a very long time, longer than you know. He was patient when Vincent Marrow built an organization that refused to absorb into the existing structure. He was patient when that problem was solved in 2001. He was patient for 23 years while the air grew up under a cover that held, more or less, until it didn't. He paused. But patience has practical limits. Serena's mind was already running the arithmetic. Not with her whole mind. Part of her was tracking the two men behind the speaker and watching Callum's position in her peripheral vision. But the part that ran logic even in bad rooms, even when the floor was shifting. Ronan had drafted the contingency document. Ronan had distributed it to 4 people, including himself. Ronan had been in the command room when the attack happened. Ronan had told her about the monitor assignment. Ronan had said the authorization code was Cassian's. She thought about that. She replayed exactly what he'd said. The authorization code attached to it is an internal identifier, specific to one person. He had looked at Cassian and said yours. But she had taken that on Ronan's word. She had no way to verify an internal authorization code. She had no independent access to the directory. She had accepted Ronan's interpretation of a document she hadn't read herself, in a room where Ronan was the one controlling what was on the screen. She thought about Diane saying, "Mercer handed me the first message." She thought about Ronan saying, without being asked, "I drafted that document." She thought about how a man who wanted to redirect suspicion away from himself would draft a document, tell you he drafted it, tell you the leak came from within that document's distribution, position himself as transparently implicated, and then point the authorization code at the man standing next to him. She thought about this in approximately 4 seconds. "Cassian," she said very quietly. He heard something in the way she said it. She saw him hear it. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the silver-haired man, but his weight shifted fractionally, and she understood that meant, "I'm listening." "The 2001 directory," she said, at the same low volume, as though she was speaking only to him. "The authorization code. I never read the document myself." A pause. 1 second. "Neither did I," he said. "Ronan read it to us." Another pause, shorter. "Yes," he said. The silver-haired man was still speaking, something about the inheritance, about legal transfer, about the practical reality of numbers. And she was absorbing it with the outer layer of her attention, while the inner layer did something else entirely. Her phone buzzed. She almost didn't look at it. Then she did, because the buzzing was a specific pattern, 3 short, 1 long, that she'd been told by no one but had seen Cassian's men use as a discrete alert signal twice in the last 2 hours. She turned the screen slightly. A message from the estate's internal system, routing through Petra's administrative line. North Corridor camera feed, timestamp current. She looked at the image. Ronan. Standing in the corridor outside the sealed document storage room. Not moving. Looking at the door with the particular patience of a man who has decided that now, while everyone who might interrupt him is 11 miles away, is the time. She showed the screen to Cassian in one motion, tilted so only he could see it. He looked at it for 1 second. Then he looked at Mercer and did something she hadn't expected. He looked at Mercer and nodded once, a small deliberate motion. And Mercer, whose hands were tied to a chair, shifted his weight, and the chair legs came up 2 inches and came down hard, once, on the floor. The acoustic of the building did the rest. The sound hit every wall simultaneously. Callum moved. Serena dropped below the sight line of the man nearest to her, not because anyone told her to, but because her body had registered the shift in the room before her conscious mind had finished its sentence, and she'd spent enough years visiting homes where violence happened in the space between one breath and the next to know what the air felt like in the second before. What followed was not choreographed, and it was not clean. It was loud and close, and she pressed herself against a concrete pillar and tracked the movement of every person she could see with the white-knuckled focus of someone whose only job right now was to stay out of the way without being useless. One of the men behind the silver-haired speaker went down. The second produced a weapon, and Callum redirected him with an efficiency that was almost administrative in its speed. The silver-haired man himself moved toward the east exit, and 2 of Cassian's men were already bracketing it, which meant either Cassian had anticipated this exit attempt specifically, or his team was trained for the most likely movement in every direction. Mercer hit the floor when the chair tipped, not gracefully, with the impact of a man taking a fall he couldn't catch. And the binding on his wrists came loose from the chair back, if not from his wrists themselves. And he rolled to the side and stayed there, head down, which was the smartest thing he'd done in this room. Serena saw Cassian reach the silver-haired man 10 feet from the east exit. She couldn't hear what Cassian said. She could see the man's face when Cassian said it. Whatever it was not a question. The man told him something. Cassian stepped back, and then the east exit opened from the outside. 3 new figures came through, and for one disorienting second she thought they were more of the same, more opposition, and her body prepared for that math. Then she recognized the silhouette of the man at the front. Ronan. He came through the door with 2 men she'd never seen flanking him, and he looked at the room with the expression of someone arriving at a party they arranged and finding the guest list had been rearranged without permission. His eyes found Cassian. They found her. They moved to the silver-haired man near the east wall. Heinrich, Ronan said, by way of greeting. Heinrich, the silver-haired man, straightened with the dignity of someone deciding how to reframe a room they've lost. Ronan, you're early. You're compromised. Ronan said it without heat. He crossed the floor toward the center of the room as though the scattered aftermath around him was furniture. Your man in the vehicle sent me a photograph of the east entry 7 minutes ago. I assume you wanted me to see it. He stopped, looked at Cassian. I assume you arranged for your man in Heinrich's vehicle to send it. Cassian said nothing. Elegant, Ronan said. Not admirably. As a category of information. Serena came away from the pillar. Her legs were steady. Her hands were not. She had them in her pockets and could feel the faint tremor of residual adrenaline, the body's honest accounting of what the mind had been trying to override. It was you, she said. The sealed documents. You were trying to access them at the estate. Ronan looked at her. Yes. Why? You helped build the case against you by showing me the camera feed. I didn't know about the feed, he said. Petra runs the camera system. I thought I had the corridor. He paused. I've known about the Marrow documentation for 18 months. I've known Cassian was the assigned monitor for 12. I've been building a case against his handling of the inheritance and jurisdictions that can act on it. Jurisdictions that will act on it, the moment I have the original document with the authorization code. To do what? She said. To establish that the assigned monitor failed his mandate deliberately, which means the protection contract is voided, which means the inheritance management reverts to organizational governance. He looked at her steadily. Which means you don't control it alone. The network governs it collectively. Meaning you govern it, Cassian said. Meaning the people who built it over decades have a voice in it, Ronan said. And for the first time, his voice had something in it that wasn't operational. Something older and more personal. The compressed anger of a man who believes he has a grievance and has been waiting a very long time to bring it. Vincent built that network from 43 separate organizations. I helped him align 14 of them. I spent 8 years building the Eastern alliances before he disappeared. And when he disappeared, everything he'd built went into a box with a lock that only his biological heir can open. His jaw tightened. A woman who didn't know she existed until 3 days ago. Serena looked at him. She understood. In the specific way she understood the parents who came to her office with righteous explanations for terrible choices. She understood the logic, the grievance, even the years of accumulated frustration that had built this architecture of conspiracy. She understood it, and she held it apart from the part of herself that was about to do something she hadn't done before. The authorization code, she said. The one you told us was Cassian's. Ronan said nothing. Was it his? A pause. 1 second, 2. No, he said. It came out flat and final. The sound of a man dropping something he's been holding because continuing to hold it has become more expensive than setting it down. It was mine. Cassian moved toward him. Ronan stepped back once, and his 2 flanking men adjusted, and for a moment the room reconfigured into its worst possible shape. Too many people, too many positions. The east exit still compromised, the north side unclear. Serena felt the moment the way she felt moments in intake rooms when the situation was about to tip past the point where talking would do anything. The specific kinetic weight of it, the way the air thickens when people have stopped being open to anything except what they came in prepared to do. Mercer's voice came from the floor, rough, underpowered, the voice of a man who'd been sitting in a chair for hours and had blood pooling in his feet. "Ronan," he said. "Don't." Ronan looked at him. "Whatever you think you're owed," Mercer said, "don't finish it this way. Not here." Something crossed Ronan's face that was too fast and too complex for her to fully read. A man encountering a voice that had been part of his life for long enough to have weight, not changing the calculation exactly, but making it cost more. Heinrich moved. He moved from the east wall toward the sealed case one of his men had brought in and dropped when Callum redirected him, and he reached it faster than anyone responded to, and when he straightened, he had the kind of leverage that made every other calculation in the room secondary. He had a detonator, small, handheld, the kind with a cover over the trigger, lifted. "Everyone stops," Heinrich said, with the specific calm of someone who has spent the last 10 minutes waiting for the moment to use this, "or I take the building." The room stopped. Serena stood in the silence with her heart producing the kind of sound she could feel in her throat and her temples simultaneously, and she looked at the detonator, and she looked at Heinrich, and she looked at Cassian standing 8 feet from her with his jaw locked and his eyes doing the rapid, invisible calculation of a man determining what the available moves were from this specific configuration. There were not many. Heinrich looked at her. "The air," he said. "You'll come with me. Just you. And your friend here will let us leave because the alternative is that none of us leave." She held his gaze. "You'll give me your word," he said, "that you'll authorize the transfer, the accounts, the alliances, the documentation." "I'll give you my answer," she said. "I want your word." She looked at the detonator. She looked at Mercer on the floor. She looked at Cassian, who was looking at her with the controlled urgency of a man who is watching someone he cannot protect from the specific position he is in, which she recognized as one of the worst positions a person can occupy. She looked back at Heinrich and thought about her father. Vincent Marrow, the man in the grainy photograph with the stillness she'd recognized without knowing why, who had built something enormous and lost it, and tried to protect the one thing he couldn't keep. And she thought about 2 letters folded in her jacket pocket that she hadn't read all the way through, and she thought about a contract signed at a dinner table by a man whose hand didn't shake. And she thought about every room she'd ever walked into where the adults were supposed to have the answers and had none. And she had to figure out what happened to the child anyway. "My answer," she said again. And she took one step toward Heinrich that no one in the room was prepared for, because no one in the room had calculated that she would move toward the detonator instead of away from it, and in the half-second that the surprise cost everyone, including Heinrich, Cassian crossed the 8 feet between them with the compressed speed of a man who had been waiting for exactly one opening. The detonator came free of Heinrich's grip. Heinrich reached for it. Cassian put himself between. The shot came from somewhere she didn't see. A shadow at the north entry that none of their 8 men had covered because the north entry was the one they'd left with minimal presence. The one she'd said would have secondary coverage from Heinrich's side. The one single gap in an otherwise closed configuration. And the sound was enormous in the acoustic of the building, and Cassian went down onto one knee with the specific heaviness of a body-absorbing impact that the will alone cannot override. Serena was beside him before the sound finished. The man at the north entry was gone, a shadow retreating, a door, the sound of running. Callum and one other went after him, and the rest of the room collapsed into a chaos of movement and shouting that she processed as background because her entire attention had narrowed to the man kneeling on the concrete floor in front of her, with one hand braced against the ground and blood coming through his fingers, where the other hand pressed against his side. "Cassian." She said it with her hands already on him, one at his shoulder, one reaching for the wound, trying to determine what she was working with. "Cassian, look at me." He looked at her. His eyes were clear. That was something. His face was the color of old chalk, and his breathing had gone to the shallow, controlled pattern of someone managing pain they can't fully suppress. But his eyes were clear. "The detonator," he said. "Callum has it. It's handled." She pressed her hand against his. "Stay with me." "I'm here." "I know." She looked at the wound. She looked at his face. She looked at the room around them. Heinrich down and restrained, Ronan standing at the center with his 2 men, and an expression she didn't have time to decode. Mercer still on the floor, but sitting up now. "I know you're here." "Serena." His voice was not weak. That was important to her. It was compressed, the way a voice goes when the body is allocating resources, but it was present. "The letters." She went still. In your pocket, he said, the second one. How do you read it, he said, when this is done? The second one. She looked at him. The building's loud with aftermath, shouts from the direction Callum had gone, someone giving instructions, someone else responding. And the concrete floor was cold under her knees and his blood was on her hands, and he was looking at her with the gray-green eyes she'd been trying to read for 3 days, and she thought, I have been in rooms this bad before. I have never been in them with someone who mattered like this. She pressed harder against the wound and raised her voice and called for Darrow, who she didn't know was in the building but had to be, because Cassian would have brought him, because Cassian would have planned for this particular contingency even while planning against it. Darrow came from the south entry at a run, and across the room, Ronan Sloane stood with his hands at his sides and his face carrying something that was not victory and not defeat and not anything she had a clean name for. The face of a man who had built something enormous out of grievance and patience and found that when it finally arrived at its destination, the destination was not what he'd imagined, and the cost of getting there was someone he'd stood beside for longer than he'd stood beside almost anyone. He looked at Cassian on the floor. He looked at his own hands. And Serena, with her palms flat against a wound that Darrow was now reaching her to manage, looked up at Ronan Sloane and said in a voice that had no performance in it at all, Whatever you think you're owed, you're going to help me keep him alive right now, and then we're going to finish this. Ronan looked at her for one long second. Then he crossed the floor and crouched on the other side of Cassian and put his hands where Darrow directed them. And whatever he was or had done or had built toward this moment, his hands were steady. The hospital was not the private kind. Cassian's men had wanted the private facility, the one the organization used, the one where questions weren't asked and records weren't kept, and Darrow could supervise everything from a room down the hall. Serena had overruled them in the ambulance with the specific, exhausted authority of someone who has just spent 20 minutes pressing both hands against a man's side in an industrial building and has decided that some things are not negotiable. He needs an actual surgical team, she said, not loudly, to the man trying to redirect the driver. Not a facility, a team, with the equipment that exists in a real hospital. The man looked at her hands, at the blood, at her face, which she knew was not making an expression that invited further discussion. They went to the hospital. Cassian went into surgery at 8:47 in the evening. The bullet had entered below his left rib and traveled at an angle that the attending described to her as fortunate, which she understood meant not fatal, and also meant several other things that were still serious. She sat in the waiting area in a chair against the wall with dried blood on her hands, because the sink in the public restroom had a line, and she'd decided the chair was more important. She sat there and did not sleep and did not cry and held the 2 letters in her lap without unfolding them for approximately 40 minutes. Then she unfolded the second one. The handwriting was the same as the first, her father's handwriting, which she was still calibrating to, still trying to make real, because handwriting is one of the most intimate things a person leaves behind, and she had never seen his before today. This letter was shorter than the first, less careful. The sentences had the quality of some compressed window of time by a man who understood the window was closing. He wrote that he was sorry he hadn't found a better way. He wrote that the life he'd built for her was a cage he'd hoped she'd never know was a cage. He wrote that the people he'd asked to keep her safe had been chosen for reliability, and he had been wrong about that, and that this was a failure he would carry. He wrote that the authorization codes for the accounts were biometric and could not be forged or transferred, which meant no one could take what was hers without her, which meant as long as she was alive, she had leverage that no one else possessed. And then, in the last paragraph, in handwriting that went slightly uneven in a way the previous lines hadn't, he wrote that he had known Cassian Vesper for 3 years before he disappeared, that he had chosen him as the monitor not because Cassian was the most powerful option or the most well-resourced, but because he was the only person Vincent had encountered in 2 decades of building an empire who had said, unprompted, that the inheritance should go to whoever earned it rather than whoever could take it. She read that paragraph twice. She folded the letter and put it back in her jacket pocket and sat with her hands in her lap in the waiting room while the hospital moved around her in its late-night patterns. And she thought about what it meant to be chosen by someone who'd never met you, for a reason that only made sense if the person doing the choosing believed that character was heritable in ways that had nothing to do with blood. Ronan was brought in by Callum and two others at 11:15, not to the hospital, to the secondary estate location, a property 3 miles from the main estate that served as overflow infrastructure. Serena learned this from Petra, who had arrived at the hospital at 10 with a change of clothes for Serena and the particular competent gentleness of a woman who had managed crises adjacent to this organization for long enough to have developed a personal protocol for every variety of aftermath. He didn't run, Petra said of Ronan. When Callum's team went to collect him, he was in his office, at his desk, with a folder of documents he'd prepared. Serena looked at her. What kind of documents? Financial records, internal communications, a comprehensive accounting of every alliance manipulation, every redirected payment, every communication with Heinrich's operation. Petra set the clean clothes on the chair beside Serena. He prepared it himself, apparently over the last 6 hours. She absorbed this. He's giving evidence against himself. He's giving evidence against the people he used, Petra said. Heinrich's network, the families who backed the operation, the officials who facilitated the asset freeze. She paused. He left himself out of nothing, but he also included everything else. Serena thought about Ronan's hands on the floor of the Alcott building, steady where Darrow directed them, pressing against Cashin's wound while the room around them sorted itself into something survivable. She thought about the face of a man who had done something irreversible and was deciding, in real time, what kind of person he was going to be about it. He'll face consequences, she said. Yes, Petra said. But the documentation is real. Darrow has verified 3 of the financial threads already. They track. She nodded. She picked up the clean clothes. She went and changed in the restroom and washed her hands properly this time, and looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. The face of someone who had started a week ago driving 4 hours to a dinner she'd believed was a beginning, and who had arrived at this bathroom mirror having covered approximately the distance of a different lifetime since then. She looked like herself, older by something that wasn't years, but herself. Cashin came out of surgery at 2:14 in the morning. The attending found her in the waiting room, which she hadn't left, and told her the surgery had been successful, that the bullet's angle had done what fortunate meant, and that he would be in recovery for several hours and monitored overnight, and that she could see him briefly if she was family. She looked at the attending steadily. I'm his... She stopped. She thought about the word. She thought about contracts and dinners, and the particular inadequacy of every available term for what the last 4 days had made them to each other. Yes, she said. I'm family. She was given 10 minutes. He was not fully conscious. He was in the specific half state of recent anesthesia, present enough to register voices and stimuli, absent enough that his face had let go of the controlled expression he maintained while awake. He looked younger. She hadn't expected that. The scar along his cheekbone was very visible in the fluorescent light, and she sat in the chair beside his bed and did not touch his hand, which was right there on the blanket, and looked at the monitors, and stayed for the 10 minutes, and then stayed for 7 more until a nurse appeared in the doorway. When she stood to leave, she put her hand over his briefly. 1 second. She didn't examine why. She left the hospital at 3 in the morning, with Callum driving and the city moving past the windows in its pre-dawn state. Not quiet exactly. Cities are never quiet, but thinned, the volume turned down to something that felt like breathing room. There were things to do. She had understood this since the Alcott building, since the moment Heinrich's detonator changed hands and Cashin went down and the room reconfigured into something she had to manage rather than survive. There were things to do that no one else could do, because no one else held what she held. She started the next morning. The accounts first. Darrow brought a specialist, a woman named Fen, who worked in financial forensics and spoke in the precise, unhurried manner of someone accustomed to rooms where imprecision had consequences. Fen walked her through the biometric process, the documentation chain, the legal architecture of the inheritance, and Serena listened with the full attention she'd once given to case files, which was the most thorough attention she possessed. The biometric registration took 40 minutes. The account access opened in stages over the following 72 hours, as encrypted keys resolved against the registered identity and systems that had been dormant for 23 years began, carefully, to come back online. The numbers were what Cassian had told her they were. She looked at them once, confirmed their reality, and put them aside. Numbers were not the point. Numbers were a tool. She had spent enough years watching what happened to people who treated money as the point to know the difference. The Alliance network was more complicated. The 43 organizations Vincent Marrow had aligned were not 43 anymore. Some had dissolved, some had merged, some had been absorbed by the same families that had removed her father, and some had spent 23 years in a holding pattern, waiting, honoring the agreement that said they waited for the heir. She contacted the ones that remained through channels Fen identified and Petra helped arrange, and she held meetings that ranged from 40 minutes to 3 hours. And in every one of them, she said the same thing in slightly different language depending on what the room needed to hear. That the inheritance existed, that she controlled it, and that the terms of every alliance would be honored, but that the nature of what they were allied for was changing. Not every room received this well. 3 organizations withdrew entirely, which she had expected. 2 threatened alternatives she took seriously enough to document and share with parties who could make those alternatives expensive. The remaining majority listened with the particular attention of people who had been waiting a long time and had learned to assess quickly whether what they were hearing was real. She made it real by demonstrating specifics, numbers, names, historical documentation that proved she'd done her reading. She sat in those rooms without Cassian, who was still recovering, without Ronan, who was occupied with his own accounting, with only Callum and Fen and occasionally Petra, and she spoke from the position of someone who had not chosen this inheritance and was not going to pretend otherwise. My father built this because he believed an independent structure was better than a consolidated one, she said, in the 3rd meeting, to a room of older men who had been part of the original network and were watching her with the assessment of people who had seen many things claim legitimacy. I don't know if he was right. I know what the consolidated structure did to him. I know what it did to people I've worked with for the last 6 years in a different context entirely. She looked around the table. I'm not here to preserve what he built exactly as he built it. I'm here to determine what it becomes. The oldest man in the room, who hadn't spoken for the first 90 minutes of the meeting, who sat at the end of the table with the specific stillness of someone who has decided to spend their authority on the one moment that matters most, looked at her and said, "What do you want it to become?" And she told him. She had been thinking about this since the hospital waiting room, since the letters, since the 40 minutes in the car on the drive to the Alcott building when she'd been looking out the window at ordinary people having ordinary evenings and feeling the specific weight of something that had always been hers without her knowledge. She wanted the financial infrastructure redirected toward the businesses that the network's decades of influence had suppressed, the legitimate businesses in the districts that the organization had historically taxed, controlled, or crowded out. She wanted the intelligence capacity, which was considerable and which she'd had Fen catalog, converted from criminal intelligence to something closer to what she'd always wished existed in the social systems she worked within. A network that could actually see what was happening to vulnerable people before it became catastrophic. She wanted the officials and financiers and facilitators whose names appeared in Ronan's documentation held accountable through channels that were used to things being quietly buried and were about to discover they weren't. She wanted, in other words, to take the machinery of something built for power and redirect it toward the function that power was supposed to serve in theory and almost never did in practice. The old man at the end of the table listened to all of it. Then he looked at his hands on the table for a long moment. Your father, he said, would have made the same argument 40 years ago, before he understood that intention and execution were different problems. I know, she said. I've read his files. Then you know it didn't work for him. He was alone, she said, and he was hiding. She looked at the old man steadily. I'm not hiding. He held her gaze for a long time. Then he nodded once, the slow and considered nod of someone transferring something they've been holding onto a different set of hands. Then let's see, he said. Ronan's accounting took 11 days to process fully. The documentation he'd prepared was as comprehensive as Petra had indicated, detailed in ways that suggested he'd been compiling it not over 6 hours but over months, perhaps longer, a parallel record maintained alongside the betrayal itself. She didn't know how to interpret that. She thought about it during the evenings when the work slowed and she had more space to think than was comfortable. On the 9th day, she went to see him. He was being held at the secondary estate location under conditions that were not imprisonment in any legal sense, but were not freedom either. He met her in the same kind of room she'd first spoken to Cassian in: chairs, desk, a window. He looked like a man who had slept more in the last 9 days than he had in a long time, which she suspected was accurate. The specific exhaustion of people who stop running is often indistinguishable from rest. She sat across from him. She didn't have a script. She decided against scripting it because scripts were for situations where you wanted to control the outcome, and she wasn't sure she knew what outcome she wanted from this. The documentation you provided, she said. It's being used. The financial threads have already compromised 3 officials who were part of the asset freeze. She watched his face. He registered this without changing expression significantly. Heinrich has been connected to a network of operations that authorities in 4 jurisdictions had been trying to document for years. Your records gave them the thread. Ronan looked at his hands on the table. Good, he said. That's all. What else is there to say about it? She sat with that. Why did you prepare it? Before we came to collect you. You could have run. He was quiet for a moment. Where? He said. People find places. People who haven't spent 30 years building something find places, he said. I know every place. I helped build half of them. He looked up. There was nowhere I could go that would have been somewhere I wanted to be. She absorbed that. The resentment about the inheritance, the belief that the people who built the network deserved a voice in it. I still believe that. So do I, she said. He looked at her sharply. The structure I'm proposing to the Alliance, she said, includes a governance layer, representatives from the founding organizations with advisory authority over the redirection of assets and intelligence capacity. She held his gaze. That's not what you wanted, but it's not nothing. He was very still. You're telling me this why? Because you helped build it. Because the grievance had a real component, even if the method was... She stopped, found the word. Catastrophic. She looked at him. And because my father's letter said he chose his monitor based on who he believed had integrity that survived the environment it was built in, I think that standard can be applied in more than one direction. I tried to have you killed. You cooperated with people who intended to have me killed, she said. It's not the same thing, and I think you know that, and I think the difference matters to you, or you wouldn't have had Callum redirect the driver in the ambulance the way you did. She paused. The route change. From Heinrich's remaining man. You sent the signal through Callum's comms before you came through the east entrance. His jaw shifted. He hadn't confirmed this to anyone, she was fairly certain. She'd deduced it in the hospital waiting room and hadn't had cause to use it until now. You were managing Heinrich, she said, from inside, which means you'd already decided how you wanted it to end before you walked through that door. He said nothing for a long moment. The consequences for what I've done, he said. Diane, Mercer, the attack on the estate. Real, she said. I'm not erasing them. The governance structure I'm proposing doesn't include you in a position of direct authority. That's permanent. She held his gaze. But there are things you know that no one else in this network knows. And I'm not in a position to ignore useful things on principle when the people I'm trying to protect can't afford for me to. He looked at her for a long time with the pale eyes that registered everything, and returned almost nothing, and she thought she saw, in the depth of them, something that had not been there in the Alcott building, something that might have been the particular relief of a person being seen accurately rather than charitably. Mercer, he said, his daughter's treatment, is being funded through a legitimate charitable structure that Fenn is establishing this week, she said. Mercer is answerable for what he did. His daughter isn't answerable for anything. Ronan nodded, one small motion. She stood up. She looked at him for a moment from standing height. I'll send someone in 3 days to go through the Eastern Alliance specifics with you. Structures, relationships, the history I don't have. She moved toward the door. That's not a favor. That's using what exists. Serena, he said. She stopped. The second letter, he said. In the file copy I've read, there are only 2 letters. The first is to you. The second, he paused. It's addressed to whoever was holding you, whoever ended up in the position of keeping you safe. He looked at her. Did you give it to him? She thought about the fold of paper in her jacket pocket, about sitting in the hospital chair for 10 minutes and 7 more and not touching his hand until the last second before she left. Not yet, she said. Cassian came home to the estate on day 14. He walked in under his own power, which she gathered from Darrow's expression was approximately 8 days earlier than recommended, which tracked with everything she'd learned about how he processed restrictions. He moved carefully. He looked at the estate with the eye of someone cataloging what had changed in his absence, which was considerable. Serena had rearranged 3 rooms for functional purposes and introduced 2 people to the household staff whose presence she'd decided was necessary and hadn't asked permission for. He didn't comment on any of it. He found her in the study, where she spent most of her working hours now. She was on a call with Fenn that she finished and put down before he'd crossed the room fully. He looked different. She'd prepared herself for this, and it still landed with a small impact. The specific way a person looks when they've been somewhere close to the edge and have come back from it carrying the knowledge of the proximity. The scar along his cheekbone was the same. The controlled posture was mostly the same, modified by the careful way he carried his left side. His eyes were the same gray-green, and they found her immediately when he came into the room, which was the same as it had always been. The Pellerman account, she said. I heard. 3 officials. Fenn briefed me. He crossed to the desk she'd been working at and looked at the papers on it the way someone looks at evidence of what a place has become in their absence. Not possessively, just reading the information. The Eastern Alliance meeting on Thursday. I need you there if you're capable. I'm capable. Darrow's opinion may differ. Darrow's opinion has always differed. He looked at her. You rearranged the East Corridor. The sightline from the main entrance was inefficient. It was. He held her gaze. It bothered me for years. She looked at him. She thought about the letter in her jacket pocket, which was upstairs now, folded in the nightstand drawer where she'd moved it when she changed clothes on day 4. She thought about her father writing it to someone he didn't know, for a purpose he hoped would never be necessary. She stood up. She went to the window. The estate grounds were visible in the late afternoon light, changed from what they'd been 10 days ago, because she'd had the exterior reconfigured along lines that Callum had identified as more defensible and less obviously fortified, which was a combination she cared about. She looked at it for a moment. My parents were arrested on day 6, she said. The financial records were sufficient. There are additional charges being prepared relating to the falsification of the guardianship documentation. She kept her voice level. I was asked whether I wanted to make a statement to investigators. I said I would consider it. Have you? I'll do it, she said. In writing, when I have the words for it. She looked at the grounds. I spent a long time being angry at them in a way that was manageable. The kind of anger you carry because it doesn't require you to feel anything else. What's underneath it is less manageable. He was quiet. He came to stand at the window beside her, not close enough to crowd, just present. The grief, she said. Not for the parents. They were alive and accountable, and she would make her peace with that separately. For the version of the last 24 years that should have existed, that I didn't know to mourn. Yes, he said, just that. Not fixing it. She found to her surprise that not fixing it was what she'd needed. She turned to look at him. The light from the window was on his face, and the scar, and the eyes, and the careful way he held himself that she now understood was partly pain and mostly habit. She went upstairs and came back with the letter. She put it on the desk in front of him without preamble. He looked at it. He looked at her. My father wrote it, she said, to whoever ended up holding me. She sat back down in her chair. It's yours. He picked it up. He held it for a moment, the same way she'd held both letters on the night she'd first found them, the way you hold something when you understand its weight before you know its content. Then he unfolded it. She watched him read it. She wasn't watching intrusively. She was watching the way she'd watched all the important moments in the last 2 weeks, as someone whose job was to understand rooms accurately so she could navigate them without additional casualties. He read it twice. She counted. His face during the first read was controlled. During the second, something loosened. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone less attentive would have caught, but she caught it, and she filed it alongside everything else she'd collected about how this particular person occupied himself in the world. He folded the letter and set it on the desk. He didn't speak for a moment. He knew, Cassian said. What? Why I didn't trigger the protocol. His voice was careful, not constructed. Careful, which is different. He understood that the protocol was a trap, that activating it would have... He says it here. He looked at the letter. He says he built the protocol as a mechanism to protect the heir, but realized after his disappearance that it had become a mechanism to locate her. He looked up. He knew I'd see that. He knew I'd hold it. A pause. He writes that he was grateful. She looked at him. You could have told me that, she said, weeks ago, when I asked you why you kept quiet. I could have. Why didn't you? He held her gaze. Because the reason I didn't trigger the protocol stopped being purely strategic approximately 3 years ago. He said it with the specific, stripped plainness of a person who has decided that this is the moment for something they've been carrying in private. I had an address, a photograph, a casework file from an agency in the city. I knew what you did and where you worked and what it cost you to do it. He paused. Triggering the protocol was never going to be something I did. Not because of the strategic analysis, because I had already decided I wasn't going to be the person who brought that down on you. The study was very quiet. She sat with what he'd said and the weight of it, and the complicated, imprecise feeling of discovering that someone has been making decisions about your safety from a position of care rather than calculation, and that the difference between those two things was enormous, and that she'd spent her entire life in environments that had not prepared her to trust the distinction. That's a lot to have been carrying alone, she said. Yes. You should have... She stopped. What? I don't know, she said honestly. I don't know what the version of this that was handled better would have looked like. I'm not sure one existed. She looked at him. But we're here, in the version that did happen. Yes, he said. Outside the light was going. The estate grounds were quieting into the particular hush of a defended perimeter, settling into evening. The sound she'd learned in 2 weeks to read as normal, the footstep intervals and the distant radio crackle, and the specific silence that meant the shift change had happened without incident. She had learned these sounds the way she'd learned every environment she'd had to navigate, out of necessity and then out of something that felt increasingly like familiarity. She was not the same woman who had stood in her parents' doorway looking at candles that didn't belong. She was not finished becoming whoever she was going to be on the other side of this. but she was present. In this room, in this life that had been hers without her knowledge and was now hers with full knowledge of the cost, sitting across from a man who had made imperfect choices from a position of something real, in a building that was in the process of becoming something different than it had been. Not clean, not simple, not the kind of transformation that anyone outside it would fully understand. Real, earned, built from the material that had been available, which was imperfect material handled by imperfect people who had decided, one choice at a time, to do the harder thing rather than the easier one. She reached across the desk and picked up the file she'd been working on before he came in. Case documentation. Not from her old job, which she'd formally left on day 8 with a phone call to her supervisor that had been painful in the specific way of leaving something you'd built yourself. New documentation. The framework for the intelligence redirection she was proposing. The names of people in the city's systems who needed what this network could provide, if the network was pointed correctly. The Thursday meeting, she said. Eastern Alliance. There's a subgroup from the original 43 that I haven't reached yet. The ones that went dormant rather than dissolving. She opened the file. I need context on them. History. Why they went dormant. Cassian settled into the chair across from her. He moved carefully, managing the left side, and the slight adjustment he made when he sat was the only visible acknowledgement of the wound. The Selene group went dormant in 2004, he said, after their primary contact was compromised in the Heinrich operation, the same operation that eventually, he paused. That was the beginning of Heinrich's reach into the network. The Selene group knew something was wrong. They pulled back rather than expose themselves further. So they've been waiting. They've been watching, he said. There's a difference. She looked at him. She thought about her father writing a letter to someone he didn't know, for a future he couldn't predict, based on the judgment that a person's character could be trusted because he'd seen it operate under conditions that made pretending expensive. She thought about what it meant to build things on that kind of judgment, how hard it was, how necessary. Then we go to them first, she said. Thursday is tight for travel. Not Thursday, she said. After you're cleared for travel, which is when Darrow says and not before. She held his gaze with a flatness that communicated she was serious, and also that this was one of the areas where she would not be managed. We do it right. We do it in person. We give it the time it needs. He held her gaze in return. He read whatever was in her face. He nodded. She turned back to the file. He remained in the chair across from her. The evening settled in around them. The light going blue, the estate quieting, the city beyond the gates doing whatever the city did, which was persist, which was what cities did, which was what people did, which was what she intended to do for as long as doing it was available to her. She was 24 years old. She had a name she'd always owned and one she was still learning. She had an inheritance she hadn't chosen and was choosing every day to use differently than it had been intended. She had a building full of people who were accountable to her now in ways that frightened her sometimes in the small hours and steadied her in the mornings when the work started. She had the 2 letters in a nightstand drawer, and the memory of a man's hands braced on a concrete floor, and the long drive from a dinner that was supposed to be something else. And all of it together made up the particular shape of a life that had been hidden and recovered and was being rebuilt, slowly, from different materials than the original. She turned a page in the file. Across the desk, Cassie and Vesper reached for the pen she'd set down. Neither of them said anything. Outside, the city held its breath and kept moving, which was the only thing the city ever did, and the only thing she had ever really needed it to do.